The terrible tragedy that occurred on July 30, 1945, has remained forever in the memory of Sergeant Edgar Harrell of the United States Navy. That night, the blue waters of the Pacific Ocean turned purple, and the air was filled with the desperate screams of his comrades. The Indianapolis cruiser, carrying 1,197 crew members, was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine, caught fire and began to sink. But Japanese torpedoes were far from the most terrible test for the ship's crew. After the crash, about 900 surviving sailors ended up in the water. There they came face to face with a much more dangerous enemy. The sergeant, who was barely 20 years old at the time, witnessed one of the bloodiest shark attacks on humans in the history of mankind. Bloodthirsty predators, one by one, killed defenseless soldiers who had been fighting for life in the waters of the Philippine Sea for 4 days. On July 30th, the heavy American cruiser Indianapolis, the size of 2 football fields, left the port on the island of Guam and headed for the Philippines. Earlier, the ship delivered a top-secret cargo to the island of Tinian, components of the atomic bomb, Little Boy, which will be dropped on Hiroshima just a week later, on August 6. Before going to sea, Captain Charles McVeigh asked for a naval escort to accompany him, since the cruiser did not have an anti-submarine detection system. However, the request was rejected on the pretext of the secrecy of the assignment, as well as the alleged absence of Japanese warships in the area. Although, in fact, the military command was aware of the presence of at least 4 Japanese submarines and at least 1 destroyer. On the way back to the Philippine island of Leyte, the cruiser was attacked by a Japanese submarine, which fired 6 torpedoes at it. 2 of them hit the target exactly. Sergeant Edgar Harrell was on watch that night. The first explosion occurred at 12:15 after midnight. The torpedo destroyed the engine room of the Indianapolis, killing the crew members who were there. The second torpedo exploded under the gun turret and the ship began to go underwater. By the nature of the damage, it was clear that the cruiser had only a few minutes to stay afloat. Before the radio transmitter failed, the cruiser's radio operator managed to broadcast an SOS signal. It was received by at least 3 American stations, but none of them reacted to the message. The commander of the first station was drunk. The commander of the second ordered his subordinates not to disturb him, and the commander of the third decided that this was misinformation by the Japanese. Soon, the ship's captain, Charles McVeigh, gave the order to abandon ship. He tried to cheer up the crew, promising that they would soon be discovered, because they were in an area where ships were constantly cruising. 12 minutes after the collision with the torpedo, the Indianapolis cruiser, shuddering under the furious pressure of water rushing into a huge hole, sank to the bottom. And with him, about 300 of the 1,197 crew members. At this time, Sergeant Harrell saw the crew members falling overboard, engulfed in flames. He grabbed a life jacket and jumped into the darkness surrounding the wrecked ship. Once in the water, he sailed away from the cruiser and joined a group of sailors who also managed to escape from the sinking ship. They had only a few life rafts, most of which did not fit and just floated in the water. Everyone was really hoping that help would come to them soon. The surviving sailors were scattered across the ocean over an area of more than 250 square kilometers. Only a part of them managed to put on life jackets. Someone was lucky to find rafts in the water, and they were able to climb on them. During the night, many seriously injured people died. Some of the sailors were delirious, having swallowed spilled fuel from the surface of the water. The nights in the tropics are especially dark, one survivor recalled, so we were hanging out in the ocean, as if in a barrel with a tightly sealed lid. Someone was crying, someone was praying, but mostly everyone was silent. And then one of the bosuns suddenly screamed, shrilly and terribly. Another minute and all that was left of him was water stained with blood. So the hungry sharks began their feast. At first, their victims were the dead crew members, whom they tore apart. But the cloud of blood mixed with the seawater attracted more and more predators. Hundreds of sharks, sensing easy prey, rushed to the wreck of the cruiser. Sergeant Harrell stayed on the surface as part of a group of 80 people. The sailors desperately clung to each other, noticing that the predators were getting closer and closer to them. Those who were injured were quickly running out of strength. When they moved away from their companions, even for a short distance, the sharks did not waste time. There were terrible screams from all sides. fresh blood attracted more and more sharks. They swam around and attacked everyone. The new day was greeted by the crew with a scorching sun, which brought exhausted organisms to complete exhaustion. Sailors died of dehydration, hypothermia, and starvation, and some simply went crazy. Often, desperate military men tried to quench their thirst with seawater. On top of that, 3 days later, people in life jackets began to drown. They were made of cotton wood fibers and could only provide buoyancy for 48 hours. On the third day, Sergeant Harrell realized that of the 80 people who had been around all this time, only 17 remained alive. Later, they were joined by a group of 5 sailors who built a raft out of empty aluminum boxes that were used to store ammunition and wooden crates. And of course, during all 4 days, the insatiable sharks appeared, taking dozens of unfortunate people with them, then disappeared, leaving the survivors terrible hours of waiting. The new arrivals convinced Harrell and his friend Spooner that they needed to move towards the Philippines. The other 12 crew members did not support the idea and were subsequently never seen again. As soon as they started moving on a makeshift raft, the sailors saw a box of potatoes on the surface of the water. It turned out to be rotten, but with a hard core. That's all they've had in their stomachs, in 4.5 days. The next day, August 2nd, a raft with people was spotted from the sky. The crew of an American bomber patrolling this area transmitted the information to the command. Strangely enough, until this moment, the Navy headquarters did not even know that the Indianapolis had been hit, and the survivors of the shipwreck needed help. Shortly after the discovery, a rescue operation began. The amphibious aircraft was the first to arrive at the scene of the tragedy. His pilot Adrian Marks noticed on approach that the sailors were being attacked by sharks. Contrary to the orders of his superiors, he landed the aircraft in choppy waters and began to pull out the victims one by one. He managed to take 49 people on board. He managed to secure 7 more on the wings. On the same day, 7 American ships came to the disaster area and took the survivors to the base. Of the 1,197 crew members of the Indianapolis, only 317 returned home. After Edgar Harrell was discharged from the military hospital, he was awarded the Purple Heart Medal. The leadership of the U.S. Navy has not acknowledged its responsibility for the tragedy. Instead, to avoid a scandal, the ship's captain, Rear Admiral Charles McVeigh, was charged. In November 1945, he was prosecuted by a military tribunal on charges of endangering the ship due to failure to perform anti-torpedo maneuvers. And although for many years those who survived the disaster resolutely defended McVeigh's innocence, he was convicted by a military tribunal. Since then, he has been plagued by undeserved attacks in the press and letters from the families of the dead sailors with hatred and reproaches. All this lasted until 1968, when, unable to withstand the pressure, Charles McVeigh committed suicide. It was only 50 years after the shipwreck that he was acquitted. And fatalists still claim that the sharks were sent as a terrible punishment to the ship that delivered the atomic bomb for Hiroshima to the ocean military base. Dear viewers, do not forget to subscribe to the channel so that you do not miss new releases. I wish you all the best and see you again.